Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to like, share, and watch the show. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor Kenneth Pomeranz. Professor Pomeranz is a historian of China and he teaches at the University of Chicago. His field includes economic history, environmental history, but also social history of state, gender, religion, and so on. He was the president of American Historical Association in the past, and his most famous books include The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World, and The Making of a Hinterland, State, Society, and Economy on Inland North China, 1853 to 1937. Professor Pomeranz, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Thanks. It's very good to be here.
I wanted to talk to you because I wanted to revisit your book, The Great Divergence, primarily for a couple of reasons. Because with the new Cold War, there is a lot of talk about rethinking the relationship between the so-called West and the rest. And secondly, there is a lot of interest growing now on rise of China. And I think to revisit some of the history would be interesting. And finally, I think with climate change, we are seeing limits of the Smithian assumption that it's just the constraints within the economy that matters, because there are other non-economic constraints now in the economy.
Right.
And so if we could just start by getting a general sense of what the world in general in the 17th and the 18th century looked like, what kind of food people ate, if there were peasants, what kind of worries did they have, what were the concerns of parents for their kids probably, what were the building materials and so on. That would probably set up a foundation for this conversation.
Okay, so I think the most important thing to remember is that about 80% of the global population in the 18th century were in one way or another agriculturalists. There are a small number of people who are involved in other kinds of food production, for instance, as pastoralists. But increasingly, the agricultural peoples of the world are pushing against those people and moving them to the margins. They're being forced onto more and more inferior land, etc., as populations grow. For that great majority who are agriculturalists, the overwhelming concern is having enough to eat and having basics like fuel to allow you to cook or to get you through the winter if you live in a place that has a severe winter. A good guess, though it is only a guess, is that something on the order of 75% of people's spending would have been for food. I shouldn't really say spending, but 75% of the value of what they consumed would have been food. Much of it they wouldn't have spent on because they would have grown it for themselves. And of that, something close to 50% would have been basic calories, grains, or in some parts of the world, potatoes. Now there's a range there. The poorest of the poor, it's probably close to 80% of their consumption is food, and of that, well over half would have been grains. Most other people are a little bit better off, but not dramatically so. And one thing to remember is that did not vary greatly across the world. So the richest regions in Europe, which would have been basically England and the Netherlands, are at roughly the same level of per capita income as the richest regions in Asia, which would have been China's Yangtze Delta, the Kenai region in Japan, and maybe Bengal, though the data for Bengal are kind of fishy, so we're not really sure. Of course, within all of those regions, there would have been some rich people who were doing quite well, and there would have been a slowly emerging middle class that has a reasonable amount of consumption above and beyond the basics, but we're still talking pretty low levels. So we're talking about a little bit more clothing than before. So, a couple of changes of clothes. We're talking about more food beyond grain. In Europe in particular, that would be meat on the one hand and imported sugar, tea, coffee, which are beginning to be a big deal in the 17th and 18th centuries. In China, that would have been roughly similar, though somewhat less meat, somewhat more other sorts of things. And in the wealthier parts of South Asia, again, not radically different. And one crucial thing to remember about the 17th and 18th century world is virtually all consumption, in one way or another, comes from the recent interaction of sunlight, water, and land, right? Whether it's food that is grown or trees that you harvest, in which case it's maybe the last 30 years worth of sunshine, water, and land, textile fibers, animals, either for food or for hides or for motive power, energy. With minor exceptions, people's consumption comes from the relatively recent organic growth of plants, sometimes processed through an animal, sometimes not. And what that means is that there are trade-offs, because every acre that is growing cotton or flax or some other clothing fiber is not growing food, is not forested and growing timber, or providing fuel for the winter, and so on. And that is a really fundamental fact of the early modern world. And it has profound consequences for the possibilities of growth. Areas that are reasonably densely populated and have somewhat higher than average per capita consumption are usually pushing up against the limits of what they can produce from their own land in one way or another. Either they're running short of forest and therefore timber, or they're running short of clothing fiber or whatever. And the way that they get around that is by doing, exactly what somebody like Adam Smith would say they should do, which is they take some of their plentiful labor, because they are densely populated, they produce handicraft goods, and they sell those handicraft goods in return for the products of the land, food, timber, etc. Obviously, there are big variations, right? Some of that trade is relatively free, some of it is coerced, some of it is more efficient than it is in other places, etc. But that's the basic story. And that's common to all the relatively prosperous parts of the early modern world. Again, there are minor differences, but the differences are pretty small in the larger scheme of things. Similarly, there are small differences in things like life expectancy, but they're very small. All densely populated areas deal with what we call crowd diseases, things like measles, smallpox, etc., that remain endemic where you have a dense human population and kill mostly young people. And so they push the average life expectancy way down. It's possible that by the late 18th century, life expectancy in, say, the wealthier parts of Japan, parts of colonial North America, especially Massachusetts, and maybe parts of England and the Netherlands, maybe a tiny bit higher than elsewhere. But if so, the differences are very small, and they're probably actually well within the range of statistical error. Which is not to say some places aren't worse off. There are definitely places that are worse off, but among the places that are reasonably well off, you have a great deal of commonality that comes back to pretty fundamental material constraints. So, a lot of scholars of early modern economic history, in my view, have sort of read history backwards. They know that in the 19th century, Northwestern Europe forges ahead, and so they spend a lot of time looking for the ways in which it was already ahead 100 or 200 or even more years earlier, trying to get an explanation of that eventual divergence. I think the more you look at the data, the less basis there is for thinking, A, that those divergences are there before about 1750, and B, for thinking that even if they are, they have very much to do with the divergence of the 19th century, which I would argue comes from things that are discontinuous, sort of sudden surprises.
I guess that's a good segue to ask you a little bit on the divergence, or on maybe to begin with about the literature before your intervention. Of course, we'll keep in mind, as you said, that all the balance that people had to make about food, fuel, and fiber, the main source was the sunlight. And so that was kind of a ceiling, and within that you could adjust between these 3 or 4 variables, but there was a binding limit on that. There was this sense, but there is still a sense that the West has always been more developed. And of course, this is more plausible if one talks about 500 years. Your book really debunked that, and you argue that it was much later, maybe towards the end of the 18th century, where the West started to take a lead. So if you could tell us, what were the most important arguments in favor of that narrative? We hear about technology, agriculture productivity, long-term capital in Europe. If you could tell us some of the most important arguments that went in favor of this narrative that the West had taken at least lead over the East very early.
Okay. So, as you say, there were many versions of that argument. The most extreme, which I think even before my book, relatively few people believed anymore, but the most extreme suggested that either it was a matter of science and that Europe alone had science, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And so it forged ahead technologically because of this science. And that one, I think, by the 1960s or 70s, it was very hard to credit that anymore. We had learned an awful lot about early modern science in China, in India, in the Arab world, etc. And it was pretty clear that, while yes, Europe was ahead in certain areas, they were behind in others, including, quite crucially, in agricultural productivity, which is a big story when most of people's consumption is food. A second story, which was quite common, was that only Europe had real private property rights. And again, the idea was that leads to a very, very early divergence, because with private property rights, the argument goes you have the incentive to produce as efficiently as you can. And so Europeans begin maximizing before other people. And there's a long, slow process of accumulation that comes from having better incentives that lead to a gradually widening lead that is already substantial before the Industrial Revolution. And again, in the sort of most extreme version of the argument, those two would go together.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be a notion of a kind of, well, what Marx called in one of his less enlightened moments, Oriental despotism, and the notion that private initiative had been crushed in Asia, and that was manifested both in a lack of incentives to produce because of the lack of property, and in a lack of ability to innovate intellectually, which caused scientific retardation. And I mean, there were obviously more and less sophisticated versions of those arguments, but versions of them continued to circulate, and actually still continue to circulate. And then a third argument was an argument that didn't go as far back in time, but suggested that the combination of the European Renaissance and the discovery of the New World had caused some kind of fundamental rupture in the way Europeans thought about the world, because finding the New World sort of blew up so many old truisms. And the combination of that and a gradual emancipation of thought from the church through the Renaissance and Reformation once again led to a kind of advantage. It also was tied up with the formation of early modern states, which the argument goes were more favorable to private accumulation than earlier states, in part because they were trying to accumulate money. And they realized that growth was good for that. And so again, the argument was Europe starts pulling away by the 1500s, let's say. There are a number of problems with those things, though. The most fundamental is that when you look for that lead in the data, you can't find it. So to take the two cases that I emphasized, if you look at the richest subsection of Europe, which is basically England plus the northern Netherlands, and then you compare it to the richest portion of China, of East Asia or China, namely the Yangtze Delta, as best we can tell, people in the Yangtze Delta on average consume at least as many calories per capita, maybe slightly more. They consume about the same amount of cloth per capita. They consume more tea, which is not that surprising because where does the tea come from? But more surprisingly, they consume about as much sugar. I mean, they're a little bit behind England in sugar consumption, but they're ahead of almost any place else in Europe. Their life expectancies are just as long. By pretty much any measurement we can come up with, they're doing about as well still in the middle of the 18th century. And I should say, when I first made that argument, I got a lot of pushback, among other things, from the people who worked on reconstructions of historical GDP. Mm-hmm. And they told me, no, not true. China's way behind in historical GDP already by the 1400s or 1500s. Interestingly enough, if you now read the more recent literature, someone like Stephen Broadberry, who's probably the sort of the reigning dean of historical GDP work for Western Europe, is now saying England pulls ahead of the Yangtze Delta in the early 1700s. So that's still a little bit earlier than I would say, but we're now down to a gap of 50 years. Whereas when I started, people were talking about gaps of 200-300, even longer. So I think in general, things have moved towards accepting the idea of a rough comparability. I should say, in addition to the statistical evidence, there are things like the travel logs of European visitors to both East and to some extent South Asia in the 17th and 18th century, which by and large don't see the people there as poor. In fact, they very often emphasize how well off they are. Again, especially on the China coast, but in some other places as well. And so the problem is that if the difference between Europe and China, and you could add other places to the story as well, I think, was as fundamental a thing as, oh, they had no property rights, so they had no incentive to be efficient, or they had no science, therefore they never innovated in their production technology, then the divergence should have happened much, much earlier. And the data just doesn't show it. The data shows real comparability, both across results, as I've just said, but also to a significant extent across institutions. So we can measure for a few goods market integration, right? The extent to which the price of a good in place A moves in concert with the price in place B, which suggests that there's relatively free and efficient trade between them. Chinese grain markets, for instance, are phenomenally well integrated, better than any on the European continent, and pretty close to those in Britain until the end of the 18th century. And bear in mind how much bigger China is than Britain in a world where transportation is difficult. You would expect much bigger price gaps in China. If you look at factor markets, the ability, for instance, to trade land so that it goes to the people who can make relatively efficient use of it, the ability of laborers to move around and find an employment that enables them to earn as much as they can. There just aren't these big gaps. Yes, there are little things here and there in which Europe is better off. One which turns out to have important long-term consequences is European mining is clearly more advanced. But there are other things in which it's the other way around. Just to give one example, so as late as 1820, which is a point at which British industry has already taken off to a significant degree and is sucking laborers out of the countryside. So you might think that the remaining laborers in the countryside would be as productive as possible, because if you had any surplus labor, it's gone. Even at that point, if you look at a kind of statistically average English farm and a statistically average Yangtze Delta farm, and this is not so much my work as the work of a guy named Bob Allen at Oxford and of Li Bozhong. Well, he was at the time at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Labor productivity per day on those Yangtze Delta farms is something like 94% of the level in the UK. or I should say more specifically, England. So the difference is quite small, while the difference in land productivity is something like 700% in favor of China.
Is
So-
this the wet rice
Right,
cultivating South
right.
China?
Yeah. Even if you do wheat to wheat, which you might say is a fairer comparison, except that then means you're looking at North China, which is a relatively poor part of China, and comparing it to England, the richest part of Europe. But even if you do wheat to wheat, Chinese land productivity is a good deal higher, and labor productivity per day is not radically lower. In North China, labor productivity per year is getting to be significantly lower because it's a shorter growing season, and North China is not as well served to transportation as some other parts of the country, and therefore markets for off-season product like handicrafts are not as well developed. But still, you're in the ballpark. And that's 1820.
If you could tell a little bit about, just to carry on this technology thread vis-a-vis labor, or land saving technology or labor saving technology, a lot was made out about the English agrarian revolution. Part of it was, of course, a social revolution, freeing up labor through restructuring property relations. But there was a lot being said about technology as well. What was your finding about those claims about dramatic agrarian productivity?
Okay, what increases dramatically in early modern Britain is agricultural profit, which is, of course, not the same as agricultural production. So yes, there are some gains in per acre output, but they're relatively modest, and more to the point, they have a ceiling. In a world before chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, et cetera, there is just sort of a ceiling on agricultural output per acre that depends on the particular ecology of a particular place. And if you look at England, for instance, there are farms in Norwich that are already close to that ceiling at around 1300. Over the next 500 years, average English output per acre does go up, but the best performing farms are still pretty much where those farms in Norwich were in 1300. What's happening is that over time, more and more farms are getting closer to that ceiling as they figure out, by their very nature, farms are heterogeneous, right? Each farm has a slightly different slope than the one next to it. It has, slightly different soil. It gets a little bit more shade or sunlight or whatever. And especially in a world where you don't have modern chemical analysis to help you, it's a slow, difficult process to figure out how to match the productivity of your more successful neighbor. Over a period of about 500 years, what's happening is output's going up, but it's not going above a certain ceiling. And in fact, by the late 18th century, there are pretty good signs that it's leveling off. That happens to be remarkably like what you see in the Yangtze Delta. So we have a handful of farms around Suzhou that in the 1200s already appear to have the same output per acre as the best performing farms are going to have in the late 19th century.
And even per labor employed per acre was also comparable. Maybe slightly more labor per unit. acre of land, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, I mean, I'll get to that in a minute.
Mhm.
And what's happening is that gradually over time, more and more of the Yangtze Delta is approaching the level of those Suzhou farms that were so successful already 500 or 600 years earlier. They're not getting much above it. And so that's a pretty similar story, and it's the story of a kind of organic world.
Right.
Now, within that, what is happening in the 18th century is that English agriculture, 17th and 18th century really, is that English agriculture is getting better at reaching those maximum yields with less labor, which of course then means more profit for the owner of the land. And so there is an agrarian revolution which is largely a redistributive revolution. I mean, I don't want to deny that there are some productivity gains, though they're mostly in the first part of that agrarian revolution in the 17th century. The late 18th century seems to be almost totally redistributive.
Right.
Now, that redistribution does have consequences for the emergence of English capitalism, right? It puts a large surplus in the hands of certain people. However, that only helps you if you can get access to additional farm goods from somewhere else, right? If you have if you have more labor that you can deploy elsewhere, well, that's all very nice, but you still have to feed that labor. And in fact,
and probably more energy as well if they'll have to do something else.
Right. And in fact, England is going in the late 18th century from being a net food exporter to a net food importer. But even more important than that is, since as we know, the big surge in production is in textiles, the textile fibers have to come from somewhere. As it turns out, where they wind up coming from is mostly from the Americas in the form of cotton. And if you do a little bit of math and you ask yourself, so let's look at the amount of cotton that England is processing into textiles, even in 1830, which is still relatively early in the Industrial Revolution, and you can't grow cotton in Britain. You can't grow it in most of Europe, in fact.
It's tropical.
Well, yeah, not quite tropical, but it needs a lot of heat and a lot of water. Moreover, most of the land in Europe is already in use. And you ask yourself, well, where else, how many acres would it have taken to, for instance, provide enough wool to provide a substitute for that? Turns out the amount of acreage you would have needed is somewhere between 1 and 2 times all the land in agriculture plus pastoralism in the entire British Isles. Right? So you would have needed 2 more Britons just to get you the textile fiber you needed.
Or wool.
Right. Similarly, Britain is, in part because of its relatively extensive agriculture, the fact that there are a lot of land cultivated per person, which is the flip side of saying relatively little labor per acre. England is among the most severely deforested places in Europe, as early as Shakespeare's time, actually, which is one of the reasons people complain about the smell of London, because they went quite early to burning coal.
Right.
And so then ask yourself, well, how
This is household coal users.
This is household
not
coal.
Industrial.
Right. Later it's used for industry as well, but the first use is for the households. So perform a similar kind of exercise, and in this case, Anthony Wrigley did this before I did. He said, it works out, again, if you take the dates of, I think he used 1800 and 1815 rather than 1800 and 1830, but I'd have to go back and check. Anyway, it's in there somewhere. If you ask yourself, how much land would it have taken to sustainably grow the amount of fuel that England is getting from its coal mines by the early 19th century? Again, it's larger than all the cultivated and, larger than basically the British Isles. So there's an enormous amount of what I call ecological relief of that stress that comes from pushing up against your limited supply of land that hits England relatively suddenly. One part of it comes from the overseas empire and the post-empire, the newly independent United States. Part of it comes from underground, from England's own coal mines, which the coal boom is partly a matter of technological innovation, but it is also, I think, could explain, partly a matter of just pure luck where the coal happens to be. And you put those things together, and you're talking about just an enormous expansion of the possibilities for consumption, that just dwarf any, very, very slight advantage that England might have had for, from the greater efficiency of this, that, or the other sector. It's just orders of magnitude larger, and it comes along at a time when growth was bumping up against these ecological constraints. And it took both overseas resources, to which England in particular had privileged access due to the history of empire building, and the shift to fossil fuels to create a kind of sudden, massive divergence. And that's really the story of the years from, say, give or take 1770 to 1830. You just don't see much divergence before that, and you see a lot by the end of that period.
Capital is another factor of production that you argue is not important prior to this divergence. If you could tell us, once that divergence started off, once imports started coming in from the New World into England, and also they found coal, so basically more energy, would that process of freeing up labor through private property or merchant capital as means of accumulation turning into investments, did those factors that were probably relatively minor and in themselves wouldn't have made the breakthrough, did that play any role? Or in other words, if we were to find shallow coal in accessible areas in China, and if the Qing's tail went for these expeditions and found ways to colonize other places, would China would have wound up in the same way of the West Europe did?
Okay, I think the answer to that last question has to be we don't know. And my argument is not that reverse the luck, and it would have been China first. I mean, maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have. I think the key claim is really that take away those things and it wouldn't have happened in Northwest Europe, at least not at that time. And so we have to imagine the possibility that maybe nobody would have been first, right? Maybe the world would have stayed in a kind of early modern impasse for a very, very long time to come, right? There was nothing necessary about the breakthrough to the fossil fuel economy and to the world of high consumption. Now, did the fact that Britain had relatively abundant capital help as the process got started? Sure. But there's no evidence that the slightly more expensive capital, and I mean slightly, that you find in the Yangtze Delta or in the Kenai region of Japan was really enough to make a difference, right? I mean, textile mills, for instance, actually didn't require all that much capital, and they were sufficiently profitable that even if the interest rates were a little bit higher, and it does appear that for the best borrowers, the rates in East Asia were only a little bit higher. That wouldn't have made the difference. There was plenty of room to profit. One good example that was not available at the time of my book, but has come to light since then. So in southwest China, in Sichuan, you have very, very thick salt brine at a couple thousand feet down. In fact, actually, in some cases, it's a couple thousand meters down. And you also have natural gas, which provides fuel that enables you to boil away the brine, create the salt. So with a large capital investment, because you have to dig deep and you have to create, basically what they do is they create huge bamboo tubes to pump both the brine and the gas up and use them. If you do that, you can create essentially a factory for producing salt quite cheaply, right? So it's, in some ways, it's a classic Fordist industry before Ford, right? Very high startup costs, but if you can mount those startup costs, you then have very, very low variable costs, and you can do quite nicely. The merchants of Zhejiang figure out how to do this in the 19th century, and they, some of these wells take 10 years or more to drill. Some of the tubes through which they transport the gas and the brine are many, many miles long. This is big capital. And Sichuan is a much poorer part of the country than the Yangtze Delta. But they don't find that they can't get the capital. When it's there, it's a question of, do you have profitable opportunities that demand it? But yes, certainly capital accumulation matters, right? The fact that England and Holland have relatively low interest rates means that they grow faster than they would otherwise. But again, that's probably a pretty small factor compared to the other things. And I think it's probably worth looping back to talk a little bit about the coal story. Because the temptation is to say, oh, well, coal mining, that was a technology story. And it was to some extent. But basically, I mean, England starts, as I said, using coal on a large scale pretty early. By about 1700, they've exhausted most of the cheap stuff that's near the surface. They're digging deep, and England being England, a place where there's plenty of rain, all those mines have to have water pumped out of them.
Uh-huh.
The pumps are basically powered by horses, and
So that's also leading to
And the
technological innovation.
right, and the horses, of course, have to eat. Horses eat a lot,
Right.
actually. And Michael Flynn, probably, if not the most important, one of the two most important historians of the English coal industry, did some rough calculations of costs and said that by the early 1700s, you were reaching a point in England where they just couldn't have expanded coal production any further if the steam engine had not come along, because going any deeper would have required even more horses, even more food for the horses, etc. It just wouldn't have been profitable. But of course, the steam engine does come along.
What about the multiple pulley argument that innovations like using two pulleys, basically increasing one tension, dividing it into two, can lead to more effective use of energy? So one horse can, if you use a multiple pulley system, one horse can pull twice the weight than otherwise.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff had already been exploited, and
Okay.
that's accounted for in the Flynn story.
Mhm.
So what does come along is the steam engine. And the steam engine is of enormous historical importance, because basically what a steam engine does is enables you to turn heat into motion, right? So you heat up a bunch of water, and the steam power pushes a piston, and the piston then can move anything from a giant hammer to eventually a railroad car, to you name it. So the steam engine is absolutely revolutionary. Is that a science and technology story? I would argue no. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the science behind the steam engine is extremely rudimentary.
Mhm.
Basically, all you really need to know is that a column of air has weight, right? That there is such a thing as atmospheric pressure.
Mhm.
And lots of people in various parts of the world had known that for a long time. In fact, the Romans had a crude steam engine. They used it to magically open the doors of temples. It was very impressive.
Right.
But they didn't use it for production because it didn't make much sense to use it for production. The Chinese had messed around with little steam-powered toy boats and things like that. So they had the basic idea. They didn't bother developing it, nor did various other peoples. What is dramatically different in England is basically, it's a combination of location and factor prices. So England not only has a lot of coal, it has a lot of coal that's sitting right near navigable rivers.
Mhm.
And this is extraordinarily important because coal is bulky and clunky, and in the pre-modern world, again, anywhere in the pre-modern world, the cost of fuel is, whether you're talking about timber or coal, is basically the cost of moving it, such that whether you're in China or in England, the cost of moving a lump of coal overland about 25 miles is greater than the value of the coal itself. So only if you're close to a river does it make much sense. Early steam engine comes along, and it can do this cool thing. It can turn heat into motion. It is unbelievably inefficient, though. The early Newcomen engine uses about 1,000 calories of energy for every 7 calories of work it does. So it's less than 1% efficient. The only place where it is worth using an engine like that is a place where the fuel is basically free. And that's at the pit head of the mine.
Yeah.
And that is indeed, even once you've got past the Newcomen engine to the Watt engine, which is more efficient, it's still only like 2 or 3% efficient. So you're still burning, 1,000 calories to get 30 or something. As late as 1800, 80% of all the Watt engines in the world are located at the pit head of mines, because that's where they're worth using. But once you have the engine, then, and there's some commercial use for it, then it is worth tinkering with it to see if, well, maybe I can make it a little bit more efficient. Maybe I can also deal with some of its other problems, like its tendency to explode. And over time, people tinker with it. It gets better and better. And by the early 19th century, you have something that you could put on wheels and you could call it a railroad. You could put it on a boat. You can put it in a factory and drive a big hammer, et cetera, et cetera. Once the steam engine has been tamed, in a sense, through a series of micro inventions that improve the original macro invention, it becomes a machine that transforms the world.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to get to that point unless you had a good reason to start using it in the first place. And that happens in England, again, because coal is in a very convenient place, and because the costs of muscle energy are high. Grain is expensive in England, and consequently, muscle energy, whether you're talking about human muscle or animal muscle, is also relatively expensive. And the possibility of substituting for that muscle energy with heat is attractive in a way that it really isn't in most of the world, which is one of the reasons why the steam engine is actually quite slow to spread even to continental Europe. Wages, nominal wages, this is, were not quite as high. Right. The trade-off just isn't as good. To give you just the example of how dramatic the difference can be. So in 1704, there was an English East India Company ship that spent a couple of months docked in Guangzhou on the South China coast. So not the richest part of China, but probably the second richest. And on this ship was a man named James Lockyer, who was the kind of man historians love, because he fanatically wrote down everything he purchased and the price of everything he purchased. So if he got a haircut, if he bought an egg, you name it. So 1704 happens to be one of the very few years for which we can actually do a wage price increase index for a major Chinese city and compare it to London. And what happens if you do that is you get a very interesting pattern. So nominal wages in London, nominal wages measured in silver, are over 4 times as high as in Guangzhou. However, the cost of calories, the most important part of the cost of living,
also higher,
is 5 times as high as in Guangzhou. And if you crunch through all the numbers, real wages are about equal. So it's not that China had cheap labor in the sense that labor was necessarily less well off. But, as I said, almost everything is much more expensive in London than in Guangzhou. The exception, charcoal. Charcoal is over 4 times, if I remember right, as expensive in Guangzhou as it is in London. which means that putting it together, the ratio of the cost of muscle energy to the cost of heat energy is 20 times as high in England as it is in Guangzhou. Given that, in which place is it worth fiddling around to see if you can improve a machine that uses heat energy rather than muscle energy? And in which place isn't it?
Right.
And that, I would argue, is a much more important difference that helps explain why you get the fossil fuel revolution in England, whereas in China, which has plenty of coal, but most of it is in landlocked areas, quite far from its richest areas. So the Yangtze Delta is the most deforested area, it's the richest area, and it's the area that has the largest number of skilled artisans who might have successfully fiddled with a machine and made it better. It's hundreds of landlocked miles from where most of the coal is. England happens to be fortunate in that a lot of the coal is sitting right on the riverside. You can get it to London. Now that's not obviously not the whole story, because you could have gotten that coal to Amsterdam too.
Right.
And yet the Dutch don't develop a steam engine. The Dutch use peat, which is a lot less effective. It's still better than burning wood. It packs much more energy into a given volume. It's basically...
That was how they had relieved some of their stress.
Right.
They switching to peat.
Right. But it's not as effective as coal.
Right.
And I don't think you could have ever had a steam engine driven by peat. It would have been a much more difficult thing because there's just not as much energy per volume in there. So, I'm not saying that factor prices are the whole story, but they're a huge part of the story. And they happen to favor adopting land-saving, labor-saving kinds of machinery in Northwest Europe more than they do elsewhere. And the big one really is the steam engine, right? I mean, take that away and you just don't have a great divergence. I mean, efficient textile production is all very nice, but it's not going to, by itself, get you out of that land constraint.
If you could tell a little bit about the kind of New World products that also played a big part, because if you would only have labor-saving technology without resolving the pressures on land, that wouldn't have done in itself.
Right.
So you'd have a lot of people outside agriculture, but you'd have to feed them. And if there is nothing, then only steam engine couldn't have solved it.
Right.
So what kind of imports that they begin to get? And if I could just throw in another question here, is the role of English investment in the shipping, which is part of the early expedition and so on and so forth. Also, people ties up the story of long-term capital, insurance, or private property stuff. How much of a role did the investment in shipping per se play in this story of relieving ecological stress?
Okay, so there are two kinds of New World imports from the perspective that I'm talking about. One are the ones that relieve ecological stress relatively directly. By far the largest in the long run is cotton, but you also have sugar, you have a little bit of wheat, you have timber and timber-related products. By the 18th century, about a third of British ships are being built in North America because the timber is cheap.
So logs are coming in.
Right. Well, logs are coming in, but even more, whole ships are coming in. Also, what are called naval stores, so things like tar and turpentine. which are basically made by boiling stuff for a very, very long time. So they're also basically fuel, are also coming from the Americas. But ecologically, until the middle of the 19th century, the biggest story is cotton. Sugar probably second, timber and timber-related products also in there. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you start to get meat, first pork, and then later beef, and you get grain, basically after the American Civil War. But that's when the divergence is already well launched. But then there are these other products and other trades that don't provide ecological relief per se, but they contribute to the building of power. And that would be precious metals. Precious metals, of course, are not things that you can eat or wear. They don't keep you warm, etc. But you can take them and then trade them to other parts of the world. You can also use them to pay people to help you build forts in Jakarta or wherever. You can use them to build power. You can use them, in the case of Bengal, to pay off local power holders and help the East India Company become politically powerful.
Is it primarily silver we are talking about, or?
I mean, silver's the most important one. There's quite a bit of gold too, but silver is, certainly by volume, the big story. And between 1500 and 1800, maybe even 1850, I'm not sure about that, over 80% of all the silver and gold mined in the entire world comes out of the Americas. It's a kind of astonishing boom. And then there are things like tobacco, which don't make anybody better off, but they are profitable, in part because they are addictive, and they help both merchants and states accumulate. Tobacco trade, doesn't make anybody healthier, but it does make some people rich. It helps make the English exchequer rich. In the late 17th century, it's been calculated that a slave working on the Virginia tobacco plantation made more money every day for the English crown than he did for his owner. And of course, he made almost nothing for himself. And those sorts of things, they both help propel capitalism because they provide a good that ordinary people will work hard to acquire, something beyond simply, bare necessities that for whatever reason people wanted enough that they would work additional hours, etc. And they also provide an avenue for both merchant accumulation and state accumulation, right? The great thing about these New World imports is that for the most part, you can't produce them at home.
That makes them more fashionable.
It makes them more fashionable, and it also makes them relatively easy to tax and to stick a big markup on them. It makes them profitable, right? And a symbiosis develops between privileged merchants, especially those in the chartered companies, but some others too.
And the state.
Right, the state, particularly the Royal Navy. And the power of the Royal Navy is just extraordinarily important, both in the ability of England to project power and extend its empire, but also in the ability of England to continue reaping gains from trade even after formal empire is gone, right? So in the case of the North American colonies, for instance, independence comes, but A, they have been set up institutionally to export, and that continues. B, the Royal Navy means that English merchants, well, English and Scottish merchants really, are in a position to reap the largest portion of that trade. And that accumulation does matter. Because one of the things that happens in the post steam engine world is that a whole bunch of opportunities develop for lucrative investments in fixed productive capital. And that is historically relatively novel. If you look at the early modern world, the wealthiest merchants typically did not invest very much of their fortune in production. They're in trade for the most part. They're sometimes buying land, but it's not terribly profitable, even if you could afford it, to buy up 1,000 hand looms. It's much more profitable to be the merchant who collects stuff from all those 1,000 hand looms and then sells it many miles away.
So it's the mercantile versus
Right.
industrial or productive.
Right. And that's, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the early corporations in both England and Holland and ask, so corporations are an important innovation that are good at accumulating large amounts of capital, and because they separate ownership from control, they are good at forcing the investors to wait for their returns. Those are really important things we know in the modern world.
Also pulling money from multiple sources.
Correct.
As opposed to just relying on smaller pool of family.
Correct. Right. So they do those things. They can accumulate a lot of capital and they can make the investors wait for their return. Or if the investor doesn't want to wait for his or her return, they can sell out and the corporation goes on in a way that a traditional partnership doesn't.
So this is the development of capital markets.
Right. Look at the early modern corporations and ask what they do. Virtually none of them before 1800 are in production. There are some that are building turnpikes and canals, particularly in the UK. But overwhelmingly what they are doing is they are engaged in long-distance trade, and long-distance trade that is typically tied up with violence.
There is this funny thing about Indian history, modern history in particular, where they begin with European trade and so on, starts with the setting up of factories. And these factories are what you are saying. In Surat, in very many places across the coast in India, these are mostly warehouses, and they had armed power.
Exactly. So Jan Pietersen Kohn, he's not the founder of the Dutch East India Company, but he's kind of the guy who figured out how to really make it work. He writes from Batavia back to the corporate board in Amsterdam, and he says, look, I can make a certain amount of money just trading back and forth, or just acting like a pirate and taking stuff off other people's boats. I can make some money that way. But if you want to make big money, you have to be a little bit patient. You have to give me money to build a fort here, to establish a colony, etc., etc. And with some coercive power and some infrastructure, I can then dominate the trade. And that's when the big money will start to flow. And of course, he was absolutely right.
The total destruction of free trade in the Indian Ocean.
Correct. And the same is true. I mean, the mechanisms are a little bit different. But if you look at the settlement of most of the American colonies, well, I mean, the Latin American ones are mostly done by the crown. A lot of the ones in North America are done by chartered companies. And again, they're done by chartered companies because the colony is going to take a while to pay off, right? You have to clear the land. You have to build the forts. You have to do this, that, and the other thing. In many cases, it takes a while to find an exploitable resource. In many cases, the first generation of settlers aren't very good at what they're doing and they die off. It takes time, and it takes time partly because it takes coercion.
Mhm.
But over time, it pays off, of course, very, very well. And you look at these, these European corporations, and it's really not until the 19th century, basically when the railroads come around, that you have a productive enterprise that really requires patient capital on the scale that makes the corporation a necessary form of organization. But once you have capital-intensive forms of production, then of course already having the corporate form available in your society is a huge advantage. But it's really only in the fossil fuel world that that's the case. Up to that point, what the corporate form is basically for is long distance trade and the coercion it's tied up with. And as you probably know, even the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, where they cannot use coercion, where they actually have to compete head to head with Asian merchants in a free trade zone, they don't do all that well. And in fact, there's a reason why the Dutch East India Company goes bankrupt by the end of the 18th century. And it's largely that they're not that successful where they can't use force.
The English East India Company was also going repeatedly bankrupt.
Yes.
That's why the Chartered Acts came in to make them more accountable.
Right. They had to be bailed out again and again. And not surprisingly, the Crown and Parliament
took more and more power in the context of bailing them out.
Yeah.
I want to end this conversation by asking you a more contemporary question, which I think is related to much of what you've said. With the new Cold War escalating between the United States and China, there is a revival of very crude and ugly form of nationalism, primarily in the United States. But you see some caricatured version of it throughout the globe. In some ways, it's a response to what's happening in the West, but there is always, and some are worse than others.
Yes.
So India or Turkey would be worse than what we see in China. As a historian, how do you make sense of the rise of a binary opposition between the West and the East at the moment of history that we live in?
Yeah, that's obviously a huge question and a very complicated one. But I think it's important to remember that a lot of ideas that we would like to think had been banished from our enlightened age never fully went away, right? And the idea, for instance, that people in East Asia were just used to living under despotism and, they didn't care about individuality, creativity, et cetera, they were perfectly happy to be tools of a powerful centralized state as long as they got to eat, which is basically the myth of Oriental despotism. We would like to think that myth was gone, but at a certain level, it never went away. And similarly, the idea which goes with it that non-Western peoples are somehow less creative, and therefore they might be good at imitating our technology, which in Trump's view becomes stealing our technology. But they're probably not they're not innovators, right? They're not productive in that sense. They're imitative and they're willing to work for very little because they have this long-standing practice of tolerating living under despotism. Again, those ideas, they might have been defeated in academia, and maybe not even there completely. but they certainly continue to circulate in the popular culture, and they're there available for demagogues to reactivate them at a moment of stress. And of course, it is a moment of stress for all kinds of reasons, right? Whether it's because real wages have been stagnant for such a large portion of the population, not only in the United States, but in Western Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, for quite a while. And it becomes easy to blame the other and to think that somehow this is the latest iteration of a long-standing process of them not really producing the new world, but kind of piggybacking on our creativity. That's obviously not the whole story, but the continued existence of those myths, I think is quite important and quite empowering. Along with that come the counter myths in other parts of the world, right? So I mentioned earlier that I don't see my book as saying, if only China or Japan or India had been luckier, they would have been first. I see it as saying that, maybe nobody would have been first. But when the book first came out, I got lots of responses from small N nationalists, above all in China, but also to some extent in Japan and India, saying, thank God you've proven what we always thought, which is that we were just as good at everything as the Westerners were, but we weren't so we didn't exploit people overseas the way the Europeans did, and therefore we didn't get this ecological benefit. And so you've shown that our only shortcoming is that we weren't nasty enough. And the fact that a significant number of people, and these of course were mostly educated people, because non-educated people were not reading a long, complicated book in English, that significant numbers of educated people reacted to the book that way tells you about the importance of those counter myths as well. And at maybe even a further level, you could say that what underlies both the myth and the counter myth is the assumption that material progress is normal, right? So if it doesn't happen, we need something, maybe even something almost conspiratorial, to explain why it didn't happen, right? Why are our real wages stagnant? Well, because these yellow and brown and maybe black people are somehow undermining us. Why did we not have an industrial revolution? Well, because these white guys were more vicious more vicious and luckier, and were able to exploit people in a way that we didn't. And again, I'm oversimplifying, but I think the expectation that progress is normal is, partly it's a consequence of the fact that for 2 centuries, material progress has been sort of normal. But if you put that in a larger perspective, those have been 2 very abnormal centuries. And maybe they're the beginning of something that will go on for a very, very long time, but maybe they won't be, right? I mean, we all know that while we're in no shortage, we're not in danger of running out of energy sources the way they were in the 18th century, but we do seem to be running short of energy sources that we can exploit without wrecking the planet. I do believe that ecological constraints, though not absolute, are real. And that we had this remarkable one-off release of those constraints through the combination of the fossil fuel boom, the exploitation of new territories, and a whole bunch of scientific and technological innovations that were made possible by the energy breakthrough. But for all sorts of reasons, we're not seeing that now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the fact that so many people have come to expect continuous material progress as that which is normal and that which is their right means that when that is denied to them, either because of environmental issues or because of mismanagement by their elites, or for some other combination of factors. Of course, it's very complicated and different in different countries. There is this natural tendency to say, we're being robbed. And it's always easier to talk about how you're being robbed by somebody who's really different from you.
Right.
Rather than by the way that the political economy of your own country works.
I want to end with one final question,
Okay.
and feel free to answer as briefly or as in detail you like. As a historian, how do you see the role of professional historians in the age where we live in? And by that, I mean that when it comes to history, our sense of not just the past, but also our sense of who we consider the others is significantly shaped by media.
Absolutely.
On one hand. So it's the New York Times still writing articles extremely influential that says that China is at the brink of a collapse, economic collapse, very recently. To social media now, the Twitters and the,
Right.
where it's not even the New York Times quality, it's fake news and it's conspiracy theories and something that's totally inventive. And it seems to me that maybe I feel more strongly coming from India, given the rise of Hindu nationalism has meant that history has been completely rewritten as figment of one's imagination to serve as proxy for a political project. Do you feel helpless as academic historians? Do you feel apathetic to what's going on in the larger world? Or is there anything that still makes you hopeful to think that you might have a role as an academic historian besides researching or teaching at the Ivy League university? How do you look at this?
Okay, so apathetic, certainly not. You can ask my wife about what happens to my blood pressure as I read or hear the news most days. Hopeless occasionally, but I think one of the things we have to do, as not because we academics are going to lead the way to something better, but because we need to be part of a broader set of movements towards something better, is we do have to stand up for the closest thing to the truth that we can figure out. And so the fact that somebody is telling stories that are just plain wrong isn't a reason to try to give up on trying to do them right. It is probably a reason to devote at least some of your time to writing stuff that doesn't have 800 footnotes and that has a better chance of reaching people who are not currently enrolled in your classes and therefore don't have to read what you tell them to read. But the research enterprise is also part of going on. And I think also part of what historians in particular need to do is they need to be alert to the fact that the people we are trying to communicate with, whether that's our students or to some extent our colleagues or the general public, are not tabula rasa. I think there's this bad tendency that many of us have to say, oh, my audience, whether it's undergraduate students or the general public or whatever, knows nothing about this. And so I could just come in and it's like, an empty field and I will lay down a layer of truth like a straight road across the fact is, no matter who you're dealing with, they actually do know something about the topic you're talking about. Some of what they know is true.
Right.
Some of what they know is nonsense. Some of it is a complex mixture. But you have to take account of that or you will never get anywhere. So if I have the time, let me just give 2 examples. So I'm actually currently working with a friend of mine. We're co-authoring an introductory world history textbook to be used in basic college courses. And when we started working on that, one of the things I did was I went and looked at maps of the world that are marketed to children. So jigsaw puzzle maps, maps that are marketed to hang on kindergarten classroom walls and are particularly colorful, etc. And what I discovered is that virtually all of these maps have 2 things in common. Number 1, every continent is its own color. So the world suddenly changes from, brown to green at the Suez Canal, or from blue to yellow at the Ural Mountains, or whatever. And what you're telling the child
Is a different.
Right, is that each of the continents are real, and they each have their own kind of essence.
Right.
And of course, you're telling them that long before they could articulate that themselves or understand it if you gave it to them verbally. You're giving it to them in an image. Also, and far more insidious, on every one of these maps, Europe is illustrated with classic buildings. The Eiffel Tower, Big Ben, either the Roman Colosseum or the Leaning Tower of Pisa, maybe the Brandenburg Gate. If there are any animals at all in Europe, as it's illustrated in these things, it's a reindeer way up at the far north extreme, or it's a bull in Spain at the other extreme of the continent. Then you go to Africa. Africa is illustrated with endless wild animals. Elephants, lions, zebras, giraffes, you name it. If there is a building at all in Africa, it's either a sphinx or a pyramid in the corner of the continent, in Egypt. The rest of the world is a mix. So China is almost always either the Great Wall or a pagoda plus a panda bear. India is absolutely always the Taj Mahal and an elephant, as if there was only one building in India. North America is usually the US Capitol or the Statue of Liberty, the Hollywood sign or the Golden Gate Bridge on the other coast, and then bison and horses and so forth in between. South America, it's usually the Christ statue in the harbor at Rio, plus a llama. And so long before the child could possibly think this through or criticize it themselves, what they're being told is Europe is the land of culture, Africa is the land of nature, the rest of the world is on some sort of continuum in between. And what that is, when you think about it, is it's 19th century racial theory.
And the people who are doing it are not necessarily aware of their biases.
Absolutely not.
They're not necessarily racist.
No, they're trying to make something that's cute and appealing to kids, and immediately. But what we're doing is we're taking ideas that nobody in this university or any other reputable university would admit to adhering to now, right? I mean, nobody reads 19th century racial theory except as a period piece. Oh, that's what they thought back then. And yet here we see it kind of seeping into our culture, being reproduced. And I think it's important when we teach to explain, and when we talk to the general public, to say, look, nobody's blaming you for the fact that these ideas have seeped into your mind. They were put there when you were a little kid, in many cases. But they're there. And we have to raise those bad ideas to the level of conscious awareness and argue with them. Because if we just pretend they're not there, then people will listen to us for an hour or for a semester. And then at the end of the semester, they forget about our course, and so-called common sense reasserts its place. And they either forget what we said, or maybe they become cynical about it and say, yeah, while I was in Professor X's class, I had to mouth this stuff about blah, blah, blah. But common sense, sensible people know differently, right? And that's part of what gets you the hostility to expertise in academia that you see among people like Trump supporters. It's our failure to admit that there are ideas there that can't be ignored. They have to be argued with. And I would say in most cases they have to be dislodged because they're wrong. But the first step to that is acknowledging that they're there. And that, I think, that kind of pedagogy is really important. And I think, it's not like it's going to be easy, especially in an age of social media. But I think it's more important than ever. If I could give one more example, which is much subtler than the one about, the maps for little kids. But I was once giving a talk to, actually it was a group of bankers who had asked me to speak about Chinese nationalism. And so these are American bankers. And, these are, of course, well-educated people, et cetera, et cetera. They're sophisticated. I assume they do read the Times and the Journal or the Financial Times or something. They're not relying on Fox News. Anyway, so I was talking about Chinese nationalism and some of the ways in which it is reproduced. And I gave the example that in any approved history text in China that covers the middle of the 20th century, there'll be a sentence that's something like this. It'll say, on September 2nd, 1945, the Chinese people's heroic struggle against Japanese imperialism came to a triumphant end. And the problem with that sentence is not that it's false, right? Because it's true. On September 2nd, the Chinese people's struggle against Japanese imperialism came to a successful end. The problem, of course, is that it ignores the fact that a big reason the Chinese people's struggle came to a successful end is that the United States had pulverized the Japanese Navy, bombed the Japanese home islands, et cetera, et cetera. Then the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria. Without allies, it never would have happened. And so I made this point, and all these American bankers nodded and smiled. And yes, good example of how they've created a myth that isn't entirely false, but it's distorted, and it fosters a certain set of ideas about the present, right? It's a statement about the past, but it reinforces the idea that China can and must rely on itself, that when China asserts itself, the whole world benefits, defeats Japanese fascism. So Chinese power is fundamentally a benevolent thing, and it's fundamentally about the Chinese people themselves. And all my bankers got that. And then I said, in some ways, it's not that different from the myth here in the United States, where our government does not force textbooks to say that the United States so single-handedly defeated the Nazis. But if you get your education from Hollywood movies, you would tend to think so, that it's Americans plus one or two maybe plucky Brits who defeat this supreme evil.
No Red Army.
That's right. And whereas we all know that the vast majority of Soviet casualties are actually inflicted on the Eastern Front. And all of a sudden, these bankers started kind of shifting awkwardly in their seats. because they knew that I was kind of right. But at the same time, they also knew that common sense did say, America saved the world.
Mhm.
American power is benevolent. Our allies are kind of a subsidiary story. Right? And then, of course, in Russia, there's yet another story in which they single-handedly rid the world of evil. They defeated fascism, and you would never know about the role of American aid in enabling the Red Army to advance, et cetera, et cetera. So, these stories circulate, and at least educated people kind of know better, right? Educated Chinese know that the US played a huge role in defeating Japan. Educated Americans know that the Red Army was absolutely central to defeating the Nazis. But the common sense that we walk around with on a day-to-day basis doesn't acknowledge that. And again, I think that part of what history has to be about is confronting common sense and pointing out where it is ideological. I mean, of course, not all common sense is ideological. Some of it is sensible.
Right.
But there's a huge amount of it that isn't, and it's dangerous. And I don't know that, historians consciously pushing back against it will tame it. But I do know that if we don't try, we certainly won't tame it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I am as a historian in thinking about engagement with the public. It's an uphill battle, not because people are stupid, but because there is a culture out there,
Mm-hmm.
and the culture has been shaped in many cases, sometimes deliberately, sometimes, as you say, not at all deliberately. I don't think the people making those maps for kids are sitting there thinking, gee, I want to reinforce old racial hierarchies. They're just, they're doing what comes easily to them. Oh, Africa, yeah. Zebras. Kids will love zebras. Let's put a zebra in there. India, oh, the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is great, right? But we have to all be a little better than that.
Right.
And that's at least part of what I hope historians and other intellectuals engaging with the broader public can do. They can push back against some of the dangerous forms of common sense that are out there.
One of the things I feel history in particular helps me is the idea that common sense is not necessarily reliable every time.
Right.
And as someone who studies history knows this, because the whole idea, discussions about historical facts and so on, does a great deal about what is reliable and what is not. And what we do there across time, one can do that across space.
Absolutely.
And can think that, well, in the present moment, as an Indian, what I hear about the Pakistani side may not necessarily be true or commonsensical in the same way that my intuition about a peasant living in the 19th century may be completely false.
Right.
And I think to that extent, history or historical methods, I think, does offer a possibility. Whether that could lead to something or not depends on where we go collectively.
Yeah, but I think you're right. And I think, and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I've given examples where the ideological consequences are obvious. Sometimes there aren't ideological consequences in the same way, but you can make people think differently by showing them how dangerous it is to project your common sense onto another person. So an example here that I really like, which has no particular ideological valence, but at least for an American audience, I think it's quite good. And this comes from a guy named Sam Weinberg, who teaches in the education school at Stanford. and as a specialist, particularly on history education. And he tells the story of going into a high school classroom, I think in Boston, though I could be misremembering, but anyway, it was a pretty good school. And he gives the students an account of the Battle of Lexington, the first battle in the American Revolution. And what becomes very clear if you read the account from the time correctly is that the colonists were ridiculously overmatched in weaponry, in organization, etc. And it was really less a battle than it was a massacre, right? The British soldiers just... And one of the really good students in the class was one of the first to kind of read the text and see that and say, oh, we're always told it's the Battle of Lexington. But boy, this thing sure seems so lopsided. Look at the tremendous advantages the British have. So then in the second stage of the exercise, the teacher, or maybe it was Weinberg himself, I'm not sure, asked the students to draw what they think the battle was like. And so this student, this very good student, who had been the one to recognize, hey, look, this is the story, he does what he thinks makes sense, which is he basically shows the colonists fighting a guerrilla war. Right? He shows them hiding behind trees, doing all the things that you might do if you know that you have this ridiculous disadvantage in firepower, etc. And he does that because he figures, these people were not stupid. And we know eventually they won, so they couldn't have been that stupid. Right. So they must have done the logical thing. In fact, they did nothing of the kind. They they had an 18th century idea of what it meant to be an honorable man and fight honorably. And so they stood out there in their rows, not hiding behind trees, which to their idea was what unmanly people like the Native Americans did. They didn't want to be like them. They wanted to be men, and they got massacred. And it's a really good, and eventually over time, the colonists did overcome their reluctance to fight a guerrilla war, and did. Mm-hmm. And that was a big part of where they went. But I think it's a really good lesson to see people who we know were not stupid, but they have a culture. And sometimes your culture can make you do things that an outsider looks at and says, oh my God, why would you do that? Even in a matter of life and death, like exposing yourself on the battlefield instead of hiding behind trees.
Right.
And a big part of what being a good historian is about is getting out of your common sense and trying to understand theirs, right? Their common sense that says, a real man doesn't do that. And I'm a real man, so I will do this instead, even at enormous cost. And that act of, you can call it empathy, you can call it imaginative reconstruction, you can simply call it getting to know the people you're studying, so you can try to think the way as close as possible to the way they would have thought, is essential. And if you learn that skill, as you just said, you can transfer it across space, right, instead of across time, and say, I'm not a Pakistani, I never will be one. But how might their common sense be different than mine? And how might that help explain why they're doing this thing that makes me either think they're stupid, or think they're evil, or think they're whatever. And that's a really important skill. It's not that history is the only way to get that skill, but it is one good way to get that skill. And it has the advantage that there's a verifiability, right? You can learn sympathy through fiction, reading sophisticated fiction too, for instance. but it's harder to know whether you were right.
Right. One thing, like something that struck me while you were answering is, on one hand, we are talking about getting out of the system and looking at it as an impartial spectator, what Adam Smith would call the impartial spectator, or Rawls would call the veil of ignorance.
Right.
So it's looking at something objectively. But I also think we are talking about even values to the extent I, for instance, believe that we cannot dissociate ourselves completely from ethical values.
Right.
So if we are talking about whether it's fair or not for someone to die from a heart attack because she was not judicious enough to buy an insurance, and since there is no universal guarantee, she should die because it was a bad investment in not buying a private insurance. And even if the technology is available, since she didn't make the investment, she should die. And I might recoil at that because my ethical values are not consistent. And I feel that history, apart from the objectivity thing, history also is a better tool to search what ethical values are better. So for instance, I read very early in my life, not very early, but maybe 15 years ago, the 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed.
Right.
And of course, there were romanticisms with the Bolsheviks and so on and so forth. But some of the things he described there, I started to imagine, why does this story relate to me? Why do I like this story? So there was this story where Trotsky wanted to enter the Smolny Institute where the delegates had all gathered, but he had forgotten his iCard. And the security guard was not letting him in. And he said that I am Leon Trotsky. And he said, well, if you are so important, you should be more careful in not forgetting your iCard. And what Reed was saying is that this moment represents this remarkable moment of something more democratic and equal in a traditional Russian society, which was hitherto not there. And I felt that this is a value I would love to see around me. And then there are histories of my own people, which I had considered my own, which are obnoxious and nasty. And then you question the values and assumptions even there. So what I'm saying is, history is not just a good way to be objective or learn the skill of being objective, but also to search for what ethical values would probably make a better world if we are careful enough.
Yeah, I think it certainly has a role in that, right? It can't do the job by itself, right? I mean, I would say 99% of us, I hope, if we read an account of the slave trade, we would be repulsed. But history alone cannot make the person who, for whatever reason, is not repulsed by that, it can't make him repulsed. So history alone, I mean, this is the old David Hume, right? You cannot get an ought from an is.
Right.
But yes, I do think that history, precisely because it both forces you to see the moments in which people are victims of forces larger than them, which certainly ought to arouse your sympathy, and I think for most people does. And it also helps you insofar as you're going to understand people not merely as victims, but as agents. You have to do what we talked about before and get inside their common sense and see both its values and its limits. And the more you do that, one hopes, the more thoughtful you will be in thinking about the values that you started with and which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to modify. And maybe in some cases, which ones you want to throw out entirely.
Right.
But yes, I do think history can have that role, should have that role. It's obviously harder to show that than it is, I think, to show that it can help you puncture certain prejudices.
Because history can also make us very emotional on the other side.
Yes.
And then can make us very vindictive and revengeful.
Mhm.
And so there's always a slippery slope in that.
Yeah.
We'll leave it there, Professor
Okay.
Pomeranz. This was
Okay.
so good too, and it was such a pleasure to have
Yeah,
you.
it's
Thank
great.
you so much.
It's great talking to you. Good luck.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.